President Sunday is a clout-chasing coward that will gladly cover up racism and play into misogyny for his own personal gain. Meanwhile, Vaush believes bigotry is something he gets to use. He also argues that Africans, if given the opportunity, would take the same actions as Nazis. Vaush himself has also framed Professor Flowers for wanting a white genocide. But first, I want to focus on what liars they both are. Sunday turned against Professor Flowers after her criticisms of him in her video. She didn't even name him, but she called him out for calling her an idiot and playing her off as so stupid she was genocidal in a debate with Vaush. President Sunday, meanwhile, fires back with a lie about Professor Flowers.
To realize that her priors lead to genocide.
Unquote.
It's because, Vaush, you hit it on the head a second ago. She's an idiot. She thinks you can do this without that. She is wrong. That doesn't mean she endorses the thing that would happen. She's mistaken about what's in their power to do.
That's my point. My point is that she's not intelligent enough to realize that her priors lead to genocide.
Observe what has taken place. Flowers has arranged what was an exchange in which I defended her against an accusation of genocide apologia on the admittedly rude grounds that she was an idiot in this matter, followed by a retort from Vaush commenting upon her intelligence into a single statement, so that I can be framed as a callous elitist, making an infantilizing commentary on her intelligence as a black woman.
It's because, Vaush, you hit it on the head a second ago. She's an idiot. She thinks you can do this without that.
I can only presume, because I can't think of any other reason for her doing so, out of spite for my slight against her ego.
You're probably watching that and getting confused, because President Sunday is alleging that Professor Flowers is a liar for framing him for making an infantilizing comment about a black woman's intelligence. But that's what he admits to doing in the video, and that he actually does in the clip he's actually showing us. President Sunday is a bad liar. President Sunday is trying to pick an innocuous mistake that Professor Flowers made, one that, even when changed, doesn't actually alter the legitimacy of her criticisms of him, as an excuse to frame her as a liar, and to remove any responsibility he has for his own actions. It's an incredibly dishonest move coming from President Sunday, and I want you to hear out Professor Flowers' side on this first.
It's really bizarre to me that this conversation is focused on how intelligent I am, rather than focusing on how bringing up white genocide causes harm to racialized people. In the most charitable cases, there are those who believe that I'm simply not intelligent enough to understand the effect of what I'm saying. Those individuals won't entertain the possibility that they might be understanding this situation entirely. And to be fair, afterwards this person told me that they don't actually think I'm dumb and felt like they had to say that I wasn't intelligent in the heat of the moment. And that at least this doesn't make it look like he's simping for me, God forbid. Even just like him ignoring Ian calling me an idiot, which happened multiple times, he was agreeing with Ian and saying I'm an idiot, and then he elaborated on it. It was just like fucking disgusting, really. I was like, I can't be your friend, because that was really messed up. This person never apologized for saying this either. And I was like, well, then that's just like not gonna really work for me, you know? I'm really glad about myself that I recognize that. I think I've gotten better at like not hanging out with people who kind of say messed up stuff to me or about me. Yeah, this person was surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. Like if I said that about a friend, I'd be like, I understand. His way of trying to defend me, which just like blows my mind. But for me, this person reinforced this idea that in the most charitable case, I'm actually just too stupid to understand what I'm saying. This person reinforced that idea.
There's more to this than you just degrading Professor Flowers. You are playing into Vaush's insanely racist argument that black people are the same as Nazis here, because you have no context for how this truly begun. See, this all truly started when Professor Flowers called out Vaush's racist argument against Dear Angel and black nationalists. In that debate, he compares not only black nationalists to white nationalists, but actually compares Africans to Nazis.
I consider myself a black nationalist, but I am not really interested in destroying white people or deporting them. I'm more interested in empowerment of black people.
That's what they'd say, though. But that's what white nationalists would also tell me.
Yes, but whiteness is predicated on destruction and exclusion, isn't it?
But that's only the case because whites are the hegemonically powerful group. The same thing could be said of Han Chinese ethno-nationalism in China, or of like Hindu supremacy in India. At the end of the day, whichever group is most powerful is going to be the destructive hegemonic ethnic group. And you're telling me exactly what white nationalists have told me. The only difference is you guys just don't have the power to start fucking people over yet. But give it 100 years, you know, Africa's growing pretty fast. I guarantee you that give it a little bit of time, you motherfuckers are going to end up being just as dangerous down the line. And I'm gonna I'm gonna want to go vacationing somewhere in fucking Congo, great time of year, you know, and then people are going to tell me that I'm like dirtying their Pan-African culture with my disgusting, like, you know, European whiteness. Like, I don't know, it's going to feel pretty weird when the tables are turned, but I guess, you know.
I mean, do you think the tables will turn?
I mean, the cycle of history turns, right?
And how this wasn't it for Vaush. In this debate, he says that black nationalists are the same as white nationalists.
Black nationalists are just white nationalists, except black.
He says that he doesn't care about black culture.
Well, black nationalists basically try to push for preserving not only black cultures, which I think is important to preserve.
Fuck black. I don't give a fuck about preserving culture.
He's making money while spouting misinformation about black people. When I saw this, I didn't understand how this wasn't it for Vaush.
White nationalism and Nazism are the exact same thing. There is no distinction between the two. White nationalism was just an attempted rebrand by Nazis. So Vaush in that debate is comparing Nazis, one of the most extreme ideologies in existence, and recklessly comparing it to every black ideology in sight. He not only compares black nationalists to Nazis, but black separatists, the idea of black people having their own culture, and even at the end, claims that Africans would be just as bad as Nazis if given the opportunity. He is comparing one of the most extreme ideologies in existence to just black people across the board. He isn't comparing extremes of both races properly. He listened to a total of 30 seconds of Professor Flowers' video before building a straw man out of her.
So right out the gate, Vaush's first statement is...
And there we go. All right, already an absolute, incredible, massive waste of time. In the context of that discussion itself, I moved off of that position. And that was, by the way, exactly 30 seconds. That was actually exactly 30 seconds.
Okay, so you're exactly 30 seconds in my video. 30 seconds into my video. And you are certain...
already an absolute, incredible, massive waste of time.
How could you possibly know?
Vaush uses the excuse that he changed his position on black nationalism as a reason to ignore Professor Flowers and justify to himself that it was okay for him to lie about her. Because in his mind, she's lying about him. But the truth is, Vaush didn't actually change his position. He still encourages the harassment of black nationalists under the idea that they're comparable to Nazis. Vaush even contradicts his own argument in the same stream, not only seeing harassment that he has caused, but then directly encouraging it.
I'm talking about how frustrating and entitled this person is for demanding an answer on if I'm a black nationalist or not. Flowers, answer the question I asked you like an hour ago. Are you a black nationalist? I'm not going to be patronized by a segregationist, so answer the question. And then Vaush just starts doing the same thing. So answer the question. Are you a black nationalist?
Answer the question.
Now, it kind of sounds funny as I'm reading
Answer
this.
the question.
This is wow, this person in this tweet is super annoying. I wonder where they got it from.
So Vaush's claim that he's changed his position is a lie. It's a lie that it was a semantic mistake because Professor Flowers' videos provide multiple pieces of evidence of Vaush demonizing black nationalists as the same as white nationalists well after the Dear Angel debate. And more than that, the claim that Vaush hasn't seen any harassment is false, because not only is he witnessing the harassment directed towards black nationalists in that clip, but he's directly encouraging it. And despite him also claiming that he hasn't seen any harassment directed towards Professor Flowers because of his attacks on her.
You know what I mean? It'd be one of the relatively uncontroversial things, especially considering how calm and patient I was. Nor have I gotten any evidence of harassment towards her.
This is also false. In a stream covering the aftermath of the fallout with Professor Flowers, he scolded his own audience for not harassing Professor Flowers enough.
I feel like my main issue here, after all of this, is that you guys didn't go far enough in harassing a queer woman of color. I feel like you guys could have gone way harder with that, you know? That's my main issue. I feel like the logistics here just didn't pan out. Like, you could have gone way harder. That's the main issue, you know? Honest.
The truth is, Vaush actually lied to her to get her onto that debate. You called out Dr. Hindao for clearly ambushing Professor Flowers, but the truth is, Vaush also ambushed Professor Flowers, and he was misrepresenting her from the very start.
We specifically agreed to talk about something else. In fact, Vaush DM'd me and said, "If you were to come on, what specifically would you want to talk about? I'm happy to talk about our disagreements, but I wouldn't want it to be some conversation in a conversation. We're talking about what we talked about before. We should just choose a topic to discuss, no?" Where I said, "Why would we talk about anything else other than accusations I've made against you and that you've made against me? What would be the point of picking any other topic to discuss?" Vaush replied, "Well, it could turn into a time-wasting maelstrom of constantly citing and looking through video timestamps to make points that could otherwise just be made by stating the positions you believe." And I said, "I think you and I have made our positions clear. The clarity of our positions isn't the issue. My issue is the misinformation you've spread and the fact that you feel empowered to belittle people while doing it." At which point Vaush said, "All right, you can come on," signifying that we had an understanding, but also acting as if I was the one asking to come on, not him asking me. Based on our agreement, I thought that we had come to an understanding that we'd focus on the accusations made on his stream and my video, which focus on how his content and audience make leftist spaces more hostile to the black leftists who simply disagree with him. And I did talk about some of those accusations, such as how Vaush needlessly painted St. Andrew and No Name as segregationist, or wanting to start a race war. But this quickly turned into a debate on anti-colonialist violence and black separatist states, both topics which had nothing to do with what we agreed on.
Both Vaush and President Sunday are obviously in the wrong, but they can't handle it because of their egos. And both use dishonest tactics like this to frame their critics as liars and then attack their character.
Aforementioned, I find myself in a position I never thought I would be in, I certainly never wanted to be in. I find myself in a position where I have every right and justification to condemn Professor Flowers as a spiteful and selfish actor willing to lie to her audience and misrepresent her so-called friends, even former friends, in such a vicious way that I couldn't, frankly, even imagine doing so to my worst enemies.
His debate with Dear Angel is of massive importance to the situation with Professor Flowers because Vaush never stopped making that racist argument. In fact, the gotcha moment against Professor Flowers hinges on you believing Africans are as bad as Nazis. And he compares them to Nazis throughout the entire debate.
Do you know what Hitler tried to do with them before the Holocaust began?
See, this is what I'm saying. Like,
Answer the
me being
question.
like people should have the right to self-determination.
Answer the question.
You are literally comparing me to Hitler and Nazis right now.
Answer the question. What did he try to do before he killed them?
I'm not going to answer the question because you literally are proving my point.
The position Vaush is holding in all of these debates is a position where black people are assumed to be automatically violent with no evidence, which is actually incredibly racist. Vaush is again presuming black people will be naturally violent, with no justification. Vaush instead treats black people like they're guilty until proven innocent. That is not the way it's supposed to work. Yet his racism is ignored for a variety of reasons, but in part, it's because there are so many people around Vaush refusing to acknowledge the blatant racism of his argument here.
Inherently genocidal in attitude, even if the measures she was airing as hypothetical alternatives to genocide were in fact no such thing. I was between a rock and a hard place. Either she was an idiot in that case, or she was a genocide apologist.
President Sunday, you weren't between a rock and a hard place in that situation, because Professor Flowers was never actually arguing for the deportation of all white people. Vaush, meanwhile, is misrepresenting her in front of you, and you chose to play into it. You knew it was wrong, but you did it anyway.
And so in the course of that conversation, in which Vaush insisted at an earlier point that Flowers' naivety was due to her being an idiot, I recapitulated that point in order to show that just because she canvassed means of ethnic displacement that she thought might be done without committing genocide doesn't mean that she positively endorsed the genocidal destruction that in fact would have to occur.
Actually, Vaush, who is arguably engaging in genocide apologia here. Colonialism is inherently genocidal, whether it's settler or otherwise. Vaush is conflating two different forms of colonialization, namely colonialization, which Professor Flowers is talking about, and settler colonialism, which Vaush seems to think represents all forms of colonialization. But both are inherently genocidal. Meanwhile, anti-colonialism is rooted in self-defense. Vaush's argument is akin to comparing murder to self-defense, and then siding with the murderer. Now, in the actual extended clip, there is not one single instance of Professor Flowers ever claiming she was for deporting all white people. She only ever expressly talked about colonizers in terms of people exploiting and damaging the country.
So it's not that every single person is necessarily an oppressor. The thing that people are talking about with racism comes down to the system that people are part of. For example, I'm adopted and my dad is white. He's a European immigrant, actually. And he might not have been a part of the people who have enslaved Black people or descendants of those people, but he's still profiting off of a racist system. And there needs to be some sort of disempowerment of those people as far as power and racist structures in order for there to be equality. So that's the point that I'm getting at. And the reason why I'm being vague is because if you look at different countries who have decolonized themselves, you have like all these different ways that those countries have gone about it. You have people who have been very violent, and you have people who have somehow done it peacefully. We're reading a book called Ujamaa or it's called Ujamaa, but it's by Julius Nyerere, who was one of the leaders of getting rid of colonialism in Tanzania. Unfortunately, after he died, a lot of things were put in place, but he did it completely through voting, which is amazing. And we're also reading like Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth. Frantz Fanon did a lot of work in Algeria, which and there was like a lot of violence that happened there. I think like dealing with colonialism is going to be messy, and there needs to be room to have nuance in these conversations. And I think just kind of reducing it to like, oh, this is white nationalism is very reductive, and it doesn't really give space for those people to talk about what to do.
I just don't understand how you could ever morally permit any plan of action which involves the deportation of a people based on their ethnic group, you know? I don't know if that necessarily addresses any of
that ethnic group colonized a group of people.
Oh, sure, but
that's how.
I don't.
That's and if we disagree on that line, that's fine.
No,
but I think colonized people have to have the right to self-determination, what to do about the people who colonize them.
I agree that the ethnic group did indeed participate in the colonization, but I don't believe in taking blanket retribution against people for their bloodline because they're associated with the bloodline. It's
not about.
Well, it is.
You should. It's about being away from the people who oppressed you. It's about taking your power back from the people who oppressed you.
Yeah,
and that's what I'm
you
saying.
Can do that without deportation.
That context should be a lens where you analyze that. I'm sure some people think so, and I'm sure some people have found that they can't. You know what I'm saying? It's very different for each country and each context.
You can do that without deportation or creating an ethno-state. In fact, I can't really think of a single time in history that ethnic disempowerment was improved through the initiation of genocide, or like mass deportation. It doesn't seem to be a very effective way of changing the socioeconomic reality of the people who were previously colonized or previously oppressed. It seems like, if anything, it's an act of retribution, that people would go, oh, well, since we were the oppressed for centuries, now we have the right to enact moral vengeance against you and remove millions of you from the country or something. And that just seems to me, I mean, not only are you basically being the villain there, it just seems to me like this is a really impractical way of fixing any of these issues, you know? Like, I
mean, I think that's fair to say, like, that you could say, like, wow, like, mass deporting millions of people is, like, not really useful or helpful. But I also think, like, when you look at people who are working on decolonizing, like, that's not necessarily what's happening. People are just trying to like get the people who have power over them to leave. And I think in that context, that makes sense insofar as you're trying to break down a power structure. That's where I stand on it personally.
If they want to leave, that's fine, but I don't think any ethnic group has any more of a right to a country than any other ethnic group.
Frankly, this is incredibly sexist treatment towards Professor Flowers. She disagrees with your unproven definition on genocide, so that makes her an idiot? That somehow her definition leads to genocides? You would never talk that way about Noam Chomsky, for example. He wouldn't agree with you on that being a genocide. Noam Chomsky's bar, actually, for what he accepts to be genocides is actually notoriously high. He requires proof that it was planned, and he's even known to, in the case of the Bosnian genocide, which I do believe is a genocide, Noam Chomsky doesn't. Because even with mass killings, he's hesitant to say he that doesn't meet his high bar. he has to see proof of it being planned. Now, I may disagree with Noam Chomsky, but I would never call him a genocide apologist. I would never call him an idiot. I would never imply that one man's interpretation of what a genocide is actually leads to genocides. But yet, that's how unfair you're being to Professor Flowers here. Professor Flowers doesn't believe deportation inherently leads to genocide like you and Vaush are claiming. The issue is, you and Vaush have never actually supported why you think that would inherently lead to a genocide. This is what people assume leads to genocides when they don't actually understand how genocides happen. In reality, genocides are always planned beforehand. The deportation that happens under the guise of genocides is always done with the purposes of wiping out the entire race. But deportation alone is not inherently genocidal, and the distinctions and definitions between them are completely different. You and Vaush act like your point here is already proven. But again, it's coming from a very racist position and is completely unbacked by any standard of genocide that I can find. See, this comparison with the Nazis, it's ridiculous because the Nazis, when they committed the final solution, when they committed the Holocaust, had already planned out the genocide that was going to take place. And they didn't deport the Jews back to countries they actually had a home in or somewhere to go. No, they deported them to death camps during the final solution. They would often kill them in the place that they deported them to. This is why many have questioned if we should even refer to what the Nazis did to the Jews, deportation. See, the Jews weren't just deported. They were then killed when they were deported. That's how the genocide took place. And again, you guys claiming that any level of deportation leads to genocide inherently, even if it's British expats who would be protected by the British government standing behind them, that is colonizing Africa to this day. And you, for some reason, think it's possible that black South Africans, despite the massive disadvantages they have in power, could possibly commit a genocide against British expats. See, you've never provided proof. Why would South Africans plan a genocide? That isn't even a good way to get your land back, as Professor Flowers points out. But she was ignored, as with every statement she made. He's just scanning for reasons to call her a Nazi. What this clearly reveals is sexism is deeply, deeply normalized in the debate brosphere. And her definitions are ones actually backed up by supporting material.
As any sense of uncertainty was seen as evidence of me being pro-genocide, and someone who was all too close to white nationalism but naively couldn't see it. So after the debate, I looked up if violent decolonization is considered genocide. I didn't find a clear answer on that, but what I did find on the legal definition was this. Genocide is A, killing members of the group, B, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, C, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. For the legal definition, the intent is a deciding factor, and there must be a proven intent on the part of perpetrators to physically destroy a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. Cultural destruction does not suffice, nor does an intention to simply disperse a group. Also, the victims of genocide must be deliberately targeted, not randomly, because of their real or perceived membership of one of the 4 groups protested under the convention, which again are national, ethnic, racial, and religious groups. After reading this, something that struck me as really frustrating was that the gotcha moment where my views were compared to genocide didn't constitute as a legal definition of genocide, which Vaush specifically references. As I've said, there are non-violent ways that you can remove colonizers from your country.
There has never been a genocide by the colonized getting their autonomy back. Fundamentally. That's why Vaush doesn't actually have an example. That's why he has to compare this to Nazi Germany. That's why he has to compare anti-colonialism to colonialism. And you have never acknowledged Vaush's constant lies. You have never acknowledged that Vaush's argument is fundamentally racist. Instead, you've entertained it. And you've played off both Professor Flowers and Vaush being equally responsible for Vaush's racism.
What they do not mitigate against is deliberate libel against someone who has fought extremely hard, not just in defense of her character, but frankly, in cleaning up the mess she made about the issues she had a hand in misrepresenting to hundreds of thousands of people.
Professor Flowers is not dishonestly framing anything here. The fact is, there have been no fair critiques of Professor Flowers, because every criticism that's come her way has been in response to the straw man Vaush built out of her. Her actual argument that the colonized deserve their autonomy back is completely ignored.
I think to the extent where they have their own autonomy again.
Well, sure.
Like, I think that's what this all comes down to, is like people need to have their own autonomy and
I
self-determination, and people don't. And so like that's really like, I guess, the extent of what I'm saying.
Each other
Well, I think
sometimes. How
like
do we know who
determining like
goes to
how to
what?
give land back would be talking to the people who are still around, because a lot of people were wiped out, having conversations of like, hey, this was your land. We want to give it back to you. What does that look like? I don't think it's just something
And
where you
why
like
are we
snap
making
your
them all
fingers
one
and it's
block,
like
right?
genocide.
Like there wasn't one indigenous people.
I'm
There
not.
were,
I'm talking about each. I literally said you would talk to the different groups of people who had land, because every people had different territories.
who
I
does
think it would look something like that, and I'm not really sure what it'd look like after that,
Who
because
does
again, I think the
Germany
instances of
originally belong to?
colonization are very different. I don't know about Germany.
this to me, the idea
Are
that
you trying to
land is
wait
forever
till
yours.
How do we figure out how colonized people can have their land back? I'm like, I think that looks like a very different conversation for each group of people who's been colonized, and I think all of them will have very different answers. My point is that they need to be listened to.
Yeah, to be clear.
Does that make sense?
No, I think it's almost incoherent. So you'd make the argument that
It's almost
if you're
incoherent that
Yeah,
I'm making the argument that
let me
colonized
finish,
people
please.
should be able to determine what to do with colonization.
So-
you can't understand
well-
that. It's an incoherent.
Yeah, because we have superseding laws and ethical structures that determine the extent to which anyone could do anything. We even have international law these days.
Vaush is actually 100% at fault here. He completely ignored Professor Flowers and deliberately misrepresented her and anti-colonialism. Vaush's position ultimately stems from how deeply defensive Vaush is when it comes to white people. He'll even defend white colonizers rather than accept legitimate criticism of them. This leads Vaush to treating black people with an extreme racist double standard. In this debate about colonialism, Vaush chooses to ignore the very premise of colonialism. Vaush is often guilty of choosing to ignore vital pieces of context when they are inconvenient to him. In this case, ignoring colonialism because deportation in that context can actually be justified in terms of self-defense. After all, the history of colonialism and genocide are actually deeply tied to one another.
He tried
Because
to remove
you literally
them.
can't. Did Jewish people colonize Germany?
You keep saying that. I don't think it's relevant. Jewish people in Germany
the
are
context
hold on.
of
colonialism
Jewish
is
people really relevant.
Jewish
It's
people,
why we're talking about
Jewish
this.
is what you don't get. Every oppressor has called themselves
But not
oppressed.
not everyone is colonized, though.
It doesn't
you can
matter.
look at the
What
historical
you're
record
saying
and determine who's colonized
What
or
you're
not.
saying-
Like, people are going to say stuff, and then there's history. There's things that actually happened.
What you're saying is that any state that can justify its sense of persecution therefore has a right to engage in genocide against ethnic minorities within their borders. Every tyrannical regime does this. No tyrannical regime in history has ever said, yep, we're on top, we're the bad guys, we're just killing for fun. They always construct a narrative of persecution, and whether that narrative is correct or not really doesn't make much of a difference.
Do you think
especially
that
since
Africans who are colonized are constructing? They're just like making up a narrative of oppression. Do you
I
think
literally-
indigenous people are making up a narrative of oppression? Do you think Hawaiians are making up a narrative of
I
oppression?
literally
Do you think
just
black
said-
people are making up a narrative of oppression?
I literally just said that it's irrelevant, and that while the degree to which it is true doesn't
Why
affect
is
the
the
state
context of
justification.
oppression irrelevant?
Vaush also completely ignores oppression. If you're facing oppression or suffering from a genocide, Vaush doesn't care about you. But he is concerned about the well-being of the people doing that to you.
Why is the context of who has power irrelevant?
Because, and I'll say it once more, and this is why you should really check your racism, my friend, that white people and colonizers aren't the same group.
Vaush is making use of two dishonest rhetorical strategies in particular. That is Gish-Gallop and Brandolini's law. Gish-Gallop is a rhetorical technique in which a person in a debate attempts to overwhelm their opponent by providing an excessive number of arguments with no regard for accuracy or strength of those arguments. Meanwhile, Brandolini's law is the rule that it's a lot harder to debunk misinformation than it is to spread it. And that's why Vaush is constantly spreading racist lies throughout this debate. The ultimate example of Vaush using both these techniques in this debate is when he argues that giving the third world autonomy would lead to a nuclear holocaust. It sounds like I'm being hyperbolic, but he's genuinely arguing that here as a criticism for Professor Flowers' actual position.
But what if they felt the only way to really do it was with unrequited nuclear warfare? You can make an argument for that. The damage that would be done to the planet through nuclear winter would at least temporarily counteract some of the climate change.
I think we already went over this. Like, I'm not saying that there should be mass genocide. I'm just saying that, like, there needs to be a way to remove the colonists if people want to remove the colonists who have been colonized.
From the planet?
No, just from being in the country that they've colonized.
Do you understand what sociological problems are? Do you think they're only the individual? Like, do you think that black crime is just a bunch of black people?
Individual. But do you really think that there's not a colonization issue? Do you really think that people do have their own autonomy
this is where I'm starting to wonder if you're educated enough to have this conversation. You keep talking about colonization, the socioeconomic phenomenon, and relating it to the actual lives of the millions of people in that country. Those aren't the same things. The sociological phenomenon of crime is not the same as the people in this country.
Of the people who colonize them. That's the issue. The power is still in the hands of the people who have colonized that place.
And a lot of crime is done by black people in the U.S. And a lot of crime is done by black people in the U.S., a massively disproportional amount. So, like,
the crime that black people have done in the U.S. is nothing compared to the slavery and colonization that's happened.
Now, that has nothing to
that's comparable.
There's Vaush casually bringing up a racist lie in order to try and defend white colonizers. The myth that black people commit a disproportionate amount of crime is actually just a racist conspiracy theory that is meant to cover up for the racist bias of the police. Black people are actually more likely to be targeted by a racist police force, and around half of them are then exonerated after being arrested. They are also 5 times as likely to be incarcerated for committing the same crime as white people. Even with these massive issues of racism affecting the statistics, most reputable sources actually reveal that it's white people who account for most of the crime in the US per capita. It is just a white supremacist conspiracy theory that's unfortunately been normalized over time. It's exactly the same with the black-on-black crime rate, something that Vaush also claims is true in this debate. Both of these myths are debunked by the source you're seeing on screen here. Lies about the black crime rate have inspired real-life terrorists such as Dylan Roof, the white power terrorist who killed 9 members of a Charleston church's black congregation. He even shouted during the rampage at his victims his belief that they were killing us, referring to white people. This was after he read conspiracy theories about the black crime rate, the very same conspiracy theories that Vaush here is claiming are true. And Vaush is unironically using this racist myth here that has cost black people their lives in order to deflect from criticisms of white colonialism, which also costs black people their lives.
If you look at colonized countries in Africa, there's so many different endings. And at the end of the day, I'm glad that those people are being decolonized.
But can't we decolonize without discriminating against another racial or ethnic group?
It's not discrimination if you're literally just trying to take your power back. Discrimination would be
absolutely can be. Wait, by taking your power back, you mean selectively stripping power from another ethnic group.
The people who colonized you.
Yeah.
The ethnic group that colonized you. That context is a little important, right?
No, it functionally isn't. You keep essentially implying that it's okay to engage in retribution. If you've been colonized, you have the right.
It's not retribution. It's literally trying to have your own self-determination. That's what it is. That's
what
the context
white
of what I'm
nationalists
talking about.
ask for. And that is explicitly an endorsement of ethno-nationalism, of deportation or genocide. There's no way to remove a large racial group from a country without genocide. There's just no way around it. You can't, like...
That's just not true. Like, literally, I just gave examples of people in Africa who, like in Kenya, for example, like the way they got colonized people out is they retook the businesses that colonized people took. And because they didn't have any economic interest in there, they left. Now, that's still not separatism because there's still white people who live in Kenya, but they were able to...
To be specific, when you say that, do you mean all their possessions were seized and they were destitute and poor and had no choice but to leave the country?
Because if that's
No,
the
it was
case,
businesses.
well, depending on how much of the business you seize, you can end up reappropriating the entire economic foundation of an ethnic group, which is what we've done to black people plenty of times in this country, so I know it works well at discouraging people from continuing to live in that area.
Vaush still assumes Kenya were as bad as the Nazis, despite admitting to the fact that he doesn't actually understand anything about Kenya. And this assumption is particularly abhorrent when you consider the fact that Kenyan decolonisation came in response to a brutal genocide. This genocide was committed by British colonisers who killed about 300,000 Kikuyu people in Kenya. Vaush, meanwhile, frames the British committing the genocide as the real victims. Were Vaush's racist views on Africans correct? The Kenyans would have come for violent retribution against the British, but instead they issued for peace. This is why many white people live in Kenya to this day and are free from discrimination. The Kenyans took back what was stolen from them, and British businesses that realized they wouldn't be allowed to continue exploiting the country left of their own volition because they had a home back in Britain. And Vaush frames the people who suffered this genocide as being a threat to these colonizers.
Still not separatism because there's still white people who live in Kenya,
So
but they were able to...
To be specific, when you say that, do you mean all their possessions were seized and they were destitute and poor and had no choice but to leave the country? Because if that's
No,
the
it was
case,
businesses.
well, depending on how much of the business you seize, you can end up reappropriating the entire economic foundation of an ethnic group, which is what we've done to black people plenty of times in this country, so I know it works well at discouraging people from continuing to live in that area.
Just to add additional context to who Vaush is claiming are victims here, these were wealthy plantation owners who were exploiting Kenyan workers. And when the Kenyans took their land back, they were compensated by the Western governments they originally came from. And they weren't forced out of Kenya because no one was. They were not Anne Frank.
This is fundamentally like, I just, the idea of using state power to retaliate against a race.
What did you want Kenyans to do? Because like they didn't commit like mass genocide. They like kicked people out by like being like, hey, the stuff that you took from us, we're gonna take back. And now they don't have any power. A lot of people got out. Like that's kind of ideal to me. It's like, what do you want colonized people to do? Like be like, hey, you know what? You guys fucked us over. We're just gonna let you have the power that you still have. Like, what would you do?
So I don't know that much about the specifics of Kenya.
Owned by British colonialism, and then when Kenyans ended that, they took back that land. This is a specific example.
Sure.
So it's like I don't see why that's like. I don't see why people taking their land back is just like we can't even talk about that, and that's kind of my issue. Is that there's like all these colonized people dealing with colonialism and it's messy. There's a lot to critique about it. There's a lot of good things in there, but we need to be able to talk about it without literally trying to compare these people to white nationalists.
So every time
that's
you
really
say
all my point.
Their land or taking it back from the colonizers, I wince because what you're doing is you're taking harm done to a racial group and assigning it moral validity by addressing them as though they had individually committed the crimes you're associating them with.
Vaush is cautious to dodge out of Professor Flowers' questions as he dodges out of all of her questions in that debate. The fact is, there is no alternative solution Vaush could possibly provide because that is the only way you can properly decolonize a country. And no one got harmed by that. Again, powerful, influential businesses were not allowed to exploit the country anymore, so they left. It's as simple as that. It's exactly as Professor Flowers describes it. Meanwhile, Vaush is obsessed with the idea that colonizers means all white people, and that it's inherently wrong despite the fact that they're not being targeted because they're white. They're being targeted because they're oppressing and colonizing another country that isn't their own and depriving them of autonomy and committing genocides in their country. But Vaush is too busy fear-mongering about Africans being the same as Nazis to care.
Interesting.
Generally speaking, the people who are... No, I do get it. I just think it makes you insufferable and sociologically ignorant.
To put Vaush's nonsensical argument into perspective, Nazis could invade your country and commit a genocide. And according to Vaush's logic, anything you did to defend yourself would make you just as bad as the Nazis, even if you fought back non-violently. Meanwhile, the Nazis themselves would be part of a socio-economic problem. That is the extent of Vaush's racist double standard here. It's also an anti-Semitic double standard, because if we were talking about Israel, Vaush would calmly tell you that the Palestinians can get their land back without genocide. And yet, with black people, he's acting like it's an absolute guarantee.
Like, I don't understand why that would be an issue.
What if they want Westerners to leave the planet because we've engaged in too much global colonization?
For instance, you guys just don't have the power to start fucking people over yet. But give it 100 years, you know, Africa's growing pretty fast. I guarantee you that give it a little bit of time, you motherfuckers are going to end up being just as dangerous down the line. It's gonna feel pretty weird when the tables are turned, but I guess, you know.
I mean, do you think the tables will turn?
Yeah, I mean, the cycle of history turns, right? Like,
Okay, but
that's racist.
The first part, it's like, I think like mass just like killing people, like having it like a literal genocide. I'm like, yeah, that would be messed up. But then me just saying like there might have to be a time where people get rid of the people who are colonized. Like that's not the same. It's just like having like a mass genocide.
Well,
like,
you know, getting rid of is a very wide term.
Vaush has an agenda here, and he's refusing to listen to her and asks her misleading questions so he can frame her out of context later.
Move the white population?
I think that they would have a right to do that, but I think that would be really harsh, and I think that they're not even going to do that.
Out of curiosity, do you know how many Jews died in the Holocaust?
I think 6 million.
Do you know what Hitler tried to do with them before the Holocaust began?
See, this is what I'm saying. Like, me being like people should have the right to self-determination.
Answer the question.
You are literally comparing me to Hitler and Nazis right now.
Answer the question. What did he try to do before he killed them?
I'm not going to answer the question because you literally are proving my point. So there are a lot of people who are saying that I'm genocidal, and I just want to clear up what I mean. What I mean to say is that there is no amount of violence that colonized people can enact towards their colonizers that will ever compare to what colonizers have done to them.
People who watched this debate without skipping huge parts of it understand that Professor Flowers' argument makes complete sense. Few have actually watched this debate in full, but President Sunday did. You knew that Vaush was lying about her. But then you played into the abuse she faced. And when she lightly criticized you for it, not only did you lie about her yourself, but you actually implied that the racist stigma around her might be true. You still support Vaush to this day, despite knowing about his racist abuse. The creepiest part of your attack on Professor Flowers, which is saying something because it's a very creepy video, was when you acted like she owed you something for not playing into the racist stigma of Dr. Heemed Out. Even though you did play into Vaush's racist stigma of her.
I turned on him to defend a much smaller streamer because I perceived that she was being treated unfairly, and that both her and what she was trying to stand for were both being grossly misrepresented. From a career perspective, it was the stupidest move I could have possibly made. Heem's channel, in fact, has profited tremendously from his live ambush of Flowers, but I made the contrary move, because despite the disadvantages, I believed it was the right thing to do. In light of the aforementioned, I find myself in a position I never thought I would be in, I certainly never wanted to be in. I find myself in a position where I have every right and justification to condemn Professor Flowers as a spiteful and selfish actor willing to lie to her audience and misrepresent her so-called friends, even former friends, in such a vicious way that I couldn't frankly even imagine doing so to my worst enemies. The characterization she gives of me, of what I said, of my psychology and my motives, is one that you can't walk back from if it sticks. It is utterly damning.
No black person ever owes you for not spreading racist lies that you know to be lies, President Sunday. You stand up to racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism because it's the right thing to do, not because you expect clout, or that none of them will be able to criticize you for your actions. I think you told on yourself here. Debate bros to me are categorized by their willingness to lie and their casual bigotry, and both Vaush and President Sunday are perfect examples of that. If she wants to talk about how badly traumatized she is because of the racist abuse you chose to ignore, she can. If she wants to criticize you for playing her off as a genocidal moron, she can. Vaush won't stop harassing women of color on the left because he keeps getting rewarded for it. He's done this to multiple women at this point. I've actually lost count of the amount of women of color he has attacked with racism and misogyny at this point. And every time, leftists like Dr. Hindao, Xanderhol, Shark Zero, and yes, President Sunday are always there to help him normalize his Nazi talking points and to help cover up his racist and misogynistic abuse of women of color. This video has only covered a fraction of the harassment he's caused. But next time, I want to talk about the danger Vaush's fear-mongering of a white genocide has put the black community in. Vaush wouldn't get away with his bigotry without collaborators like you, willfully ignoring it and covering for him because you think it's a more financially viable choice. Men like you are why there is an industry of degrading black women, and why they're expected to be silent about it. I'd recommend watching Tia Noir's video on this topic. I'd also recommend hearing out Professor Flowers' side. President Sunday, after all, did not. Then unsubscribing from the racist opportunists that President Sunday and Vaush have proven themselves to be.
Is white TV allowed in a black ethno-state? Because ethno-states tend to be pretty protective of the perceived culture of a racial group. What happens to people of different cultures who come in there? What if there are black people who disagree with the values of the black people in the ethno-state that were created? Black Americans and black Africans are nothing alike because one of them are Americans and the other Africans.